Hello and welcome to lecture number 2, part 1, just sort of titled The Early 20th Century. It's kind of a general lecture. Again, this is a survey class. My hair is going a little crazy. I don't know what's up with that. C'est la vie. I did want to show you guys. I always tell my friends that I have a $250,000 piece of artwork. There it is, right there behind me. All those lovely degrees that I paid so much money for. Anyways, I'll just sort of start by saying that you can get the lecture outline on Blackboard, so you can follow along and take notes. I know these first 2 weeks we've done these video lectures. That won't be the case next week as long as it's not snowing or something. But we do need to remember that we will have those in-person lectures in the future. And you'll be doing assignments typically on Wednesdays. But for right now, and if you hear squeaking in the background, that is my dog. And he has found his squeaky toy. So I apologize for that in advance. But he's a puppy, and there's not much I can do about it. So I want to give you guys a general overview of what the world was like in the early 20th century. And, if you think that we've had lots of innovations and leaps forward in your lives and mine, I had the internet, I had, satellite television, HD television, all that fun stuff. But then, we have iPhones in the 2000s, you have AI now, social media. That same stuff is going on in the early 20th century. At the turn of the century, you think about all the massive new innovations that we're going to have in a span of a couple decades. You have flight for the first time. You have the telephone, which has only been around for a little while. Even electricity's not been around that long. You have radio. You talk about dispersing information. Today we look at the internet and get our information, maybe on TikTok or something. Probably shouldn't get your news from TikTok, just letting you know. But the whole thing here is that you have this massive progress forward. And one of the big things that's going to happen is the world's going to start to become more interconnected. The past, where we used to have sort of countries could isolate themselves from the rest of the world, and the United States is going to try to do that a little bit. But it's really just not feasible by the time we get to the 20th century. The interconnectedness, the improvements in shipping, we'll get the Erie, well, not the Erie Canal, but the Panama Canal will come about in the 19-teens, really kind of changing the interplay of the world. Now, as far as the world goes, I want to give you guys an overview of what's going on throughout the world regionally. Down in Africa, or I guess over in Africa, it's a bit of a mess. Colonization has taken root in Africa. What was at the beginning of the 19th century sort of tribalism with African tribes kind of ruling the roost has been replaced by the British and the Dutch, French, etc. Taking control over. I'm really sorry about the squeaking, but there's nothing I can do, and this is the third time I've tried to record this video. Yeah. But anyways, so just try to pay attention. These foreign countries come into Africa, and we see in World War I how these colonies are going to affect the spread of that war and how there'll be fighting throughout these colonies in Africa. The English have fought a couple wars in Africa with various tribes. You have the Boer Wars, which will see the Dutch and the English fighting against tribes. It's really kind of a lawless place, and as these countries are industrializing, there's going to be a mad dash for resources, and that can be everything. If you look down in Africa, northern Africa, there's oil. They're all just sorts of resources that these countries are going to want. Now, if we move to the Middle East, kind of the same story. You have a colonialism going on there. The British have a very prominent presence. Also, the Ottoman Turks. Oil, not as prevalent as it is today, but it's starting to get there. Especially access to the Mediterranean is very important for these countries. If we go further east over to Asia, I'm not going to focus a whole lot on the vast majority of Asia. I'll focus on the two big players really in the region at this time, which would be China and Japan, and they couldn't be more different at this period. The Chinese are lagging behind. They have not had the progress that other nations have had. They've actually been held down by foreign powers who, while they're not colonies in China, China's not a colony, there is a presence of England, Germany, France, eventually the United States, and the Portuguese/Dutch as well, that are all trading in China. And England actually is going to fight 2 opium wars in the 1800s. That's right, opium, opium, opiates, drugs. What happens is that England controls India and Afghanistan, and the market for tea kind of bottoms out in the 1800s. And so England needs to turn a profit. Well, what does India and Afghanistan produce a lot of? Poppy plants. And they turn that poppy into opium. That opium is then sold. They basically will then get China addicted to opium. England, I joke, but it's true. They're the world's largest drug dealer, essentially. It's an entire nation. And what they would do is they take... Opium is kind of brownish, blackish, sticky. They would shape it to look like cannonballs and smuggle it into China, and where it would be sold at these illegal opium dens. But United States will eventually get involved and wants an open door policy in China where we can trade freely. And I don't use this word lightly, but it'll come up a couple times in this class. The way the Chinese view this foreign intrusion is that their resources are being raped and pillaged by the European and American powers. And so China's a bit of a mess. Now we go over to Japan. Now Japan in the 1800s, they had an encounter with an American warship. And when the American warship got there, the Japanese were like, we've got to get ourselves shaped up or we're going to fall massively behind. And so Japan, through the latter half of the 1800s, starts to industrialize. And as they industrialize, they also start to militarize. Japan will be a highly militaristic and industrial country come the time of World War II. And they're even there by the early 1900s. A completely different matter or state of affairs in Japan than in China. One of them, Japan, is modernizing. The other, in China, is still sort of stuck in the past. So that's what's going on there. In Latin America, over the course of the 1800s, you had lots of independence movements throughout Latin America, kind of in the wake of the American Revolution. Mexico will get its independence from Spain. Brazil will get its independence from from the Portuguese. All these different nations start to get their independence. Now, one of the things that happens is that, especially in Mexico, while they get their independence from Spain, essentially in the latter half of the 1800s, a man by the name of Porfirio Diaz becomes a dictator in Mexico. And this will continue to be a problem until 1910, when there's another Mexican Revolution in which the more, I'll say, democratic forces take over Mexico. The reality is that essentially for 76 years, Mexico will have one-party rule in the 20th century that will last until the year 2000, when finally a different party wins a presidential election in Mexico. Of course, we'll have our issues with Mexico around World War I. There's a thing called the Zimmerman Note, where the Germans tried to goad Mexico into fighting a war with the United States. But really, the world is pretty tumultuous. Germany has formed in the late 1800s, become a solid nation. But now let's look over at Europe, and specifically, let's talk about Russia. So this is the second point here. Russia, kind of like China, except not really the foreign presence there. But Russia is very, very slow to industrialize. And when we start the 1900s, we are dealing with the reign of Tsar Nicholas II. And Tsar Nicholas II, he's an absolute ruler. Just take the squeaking in for a second. There you go. Now, Tsar Nicholas II, really not that modern of a man, and You'll see here on the notes it says Tsar Nikolai II. We can call him Tsar Nicholas. You can also spell Tsar C-Z-A-R or T-S-A-R. There's multiple spellings of that. Now, Tsar Nicholas was very religious. His family was kind of inbred a little bit, which royal lines happen to occur a lot in Europe. And especially his youngest son suffered from a disease where he would bruise easily and bleed very easily. And so if you really want to get into some of the crazier things about the Tsar Nicholas, especially toward the end of his reign, you can watch stuff about Rasputin, who was a mystic that allegedly could heal his son, when in reality, most people say that Rasputin was just drugging his son, or maybe even hypnotizing him, if you believe in that. But, so the challenges are that Russia is still sort of in this feudal state, where they have serfs. They're not really progressing anywhere near capitalism. There's political stagnation. The people don't really have rights. And this is going to start to bubble up and boil over. And then we get the revolution of 1905. Now, the revolution of 1905 comes in the wake of the Russo-Japanese War. And the Russo-Japanese War was an absolute example of a modernized country taking on this country sort of stuck in the past. When the Russians went to fight the Japanese, they thought it was going to be that traditional line up and shoot at each other warfare, but it wasn't. They're fighting over an area called the Kuril Islands, north of Japan. It's still a point of contention today between those countries. And it quickly turns into trench warfare. Trench warfare with machine guns. It's really a precursor to what people should have been expecting in World War I. But again, the European nations were pretty slow to adapt to understanding all this new technology that we're going to have in this period. There were several events. There was a Bloody Sunday, mass riots on the street. People are going to be assassinated, killed, etc. And Tsar Nicholas, sensing the issues here, decides to form what's known as the Duma. And the Duma is a legislative body in Russia that it's there to guide legislation and to try to guide Russia in the wake of this disaster of the Russo-Japanese War to the future. But they're still dealing with that. They're still dealing with that sort of hangover from Tsar Nicholas not really having this want or know-how in many cases to create a modernized nation in Russia. And so what we get from this is more problems. And that's where we're going to sort of move on. Fast forward to 1914, and Russia joins World War I. And most Russians are like, why are we fighting? Like, we don't care about the Serbians. We care about us. We're poor. What are we doing? Why are we fighting in this war? And the next thing you know, the body bags start to come home. The death toll rises. Russia is going to lose millions of troops in that conflict. And so all of this leads to more issues that are going to take over the home front in Russia. In February of 1917, there is going to be a revolution that is going to overthrow Tsar Nicholas and remove him from office. And he will essentially, be murdered because of it. By the way, Rasputin, to kill him, they had to shoot him, hang him, and drown him, and the guy just would not die. Now, what comes after the February Revolution is a period of a provisional government that was not popular, to say the least. And you have this huge power vacuum. And during this period, you're going to have two groups that are going to war with each other. And we got a couple names for them. The color names are the Red Army and the White Forces. The Red Army is known as the Bolsheviks, and that loosely translates in Russian to the majority. Now, they weren't the majority. They were communists, they were in a minority, but Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, aka V.I. Lenin, or just Lenin, who is their leader, positions them through propaganda as being the majority view in Russia. The other party is called the Mensheviks, and that kind of sounds like minority, and that's what it was. They were basically labeled the minority opinion, and they were actually far more prominent, and they were much more on the capitalist side of the aisle. They wanted to work with the rest of Europe, institute capitalist policies. So you have two diametrically opposed groups going after each other, and what happens is that there is a civil war between the white and reds. So after the February Revolution, not only does Tsar Nicholas abdicate, but Russia pulls out of World War I. Now, we're going to basically come in and replace Russia, and we're going to bring all sorts of supplies and everything else. But this war is going to rage in Russia for quite some time, as the Bolshevik Revolution will continue effectively. The Russian Civil War and the October Revolution will continue from November of 1917 to October of 1922. And it's not until then that we get the formation of the USSR. And this is where the Soviet Union comes into play. Now, what is the Soviet Union? Well, the USSR stands for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Now, I just said the word socialist, but they're communist. Confusing, I know. Here's the thing, though, and I want to state this just for the record because it's very important. There has been no country in the history of humankind that has actually put into place actual communism. And part of the reason for that is when Karl Marx lays out his plan for communism, he says that a country has to go through an evolution. It has to go from essentially this feudal state, maybe to a monarchy, then to maybe mercantilism, then to capitalism, then to socialism, and then eventually to communism. No country has done that. Here in the United States, we're in capitalism. If we were ever going to become communist, theoretically, we would have two more steps. Russia jumps over a ton of steps and goes from being basically feudal, skips over capitalism, socialism, all that, and goes straight to communism. The problem with this is that it's not real communism, because real communism isn't supposed to have a dictator, which is what Russia is going to develop eventually, especially under Joseph Stalin. So when this civil war all plays out, the Red Army and the Bolsheviks win. They are going to then try to create satellite nations, and that's where we get this union aspect. Russia is not theoretically going to take over other countries, but they are. And they're going to do so by letting those countries have their own governments, but those governments basically answer, and when we talk about Russia, we can say they answer to Moscow or they answer to the Kremlin, which is, for the lack of a better comparison, the Russian White House, essentially. So the formation of the Soviet Union, huge, because now there's a diametrically opposed force in Europe from the eastern force of the Soviet Union, who is communist, to the capitalist forces in the West of countries, and eventually even fascist with Germany, but for the time being capitalist. But, Germany, France, England, all those other countries over there, and then also the United States of America. Now, by 1922, the United States is sort of like, whoa, we are all good. We do not need to get involved with international affairs, and we're going to kind of stay that way in the 1920s. But the reality of it is the cat's out of the bag. Globalization is coming, and now we're going to have more diplomatic attempts, more diplomatic efforts. All right. Well, sorry about the squeaking. That is part 1. I will continue on with part 2 here in you can just watch that. And I hope you guys are staying warm, and I look forward to seeing you next week.